Thank you so much, Kim. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Claire Kramsch to you. So a little bit about Dr. Kramsch. Claire Kramsch is Emerita Professor of German and Affiliate Professor. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you.
You can hear me. Okay, sorry. There was a little bit of, wasn't popping up on my screen. Okay, good. So Claire Kramsch is Emerita Professor of German and Affiliate Professor of Education at the University of California, Berkeley, where she taught courses in German and in applied linguistics, and where she was the founding director of the Berkeley Language Center. Her areas of interest are applied linguistics, language learning and teaching, language and culture, and bi and multilingualism. Her many publications include Interaction et discours dans la classe de langue, Context and Culture in Language Teaching, Language and Culture, The Multilingual Subject, The Multilingual Instructor with Liua Zhang, and Language as Symbolic Power. She is the past president of the American and the International Association of Applied Linguistics and the past editor of the International Journal of Applied Linguistics. She is currently the co-editor of 2 book series with Routledge and Cambridge University Press, and the editor of the LT. All right, and so without further ado, I will hand this over to Claire Kramsch.
Thank you so much, Vishna, for the kind introduction. Thank you, Marconi, for inviting me to this exciting global virtual forum. And thank you all for attending from wherever you are in the world. I very much look forward to sharing with you some ideas on the decolonization of foreign language education. It is basically a work in progress because, as I will talk about in my 3rd part of this paper, I'll be talking about an edited volume that I'm preparing with some Latin American colleagues that are raising a lot of questions about the topic that we'll be discussing. So I will be talking about foreign language education, and I will tell you what I mean by that. After introducing what's the problem, I will talk a little bit about what I see in the landscape, what has been published already, and that we could call decolonization research, although it doesn't always go under that flag among foreign language teachers and researchers. I will then, in a second part, discuss with you some contested, controversial, debatable issues related to the decolonization of foreign language education that I touched a little bit in the paper that was, I think, distributed among you and that appeared in Donaldo Macedo's volume. And then in a third part, I will be talking about that current forthcoming project, and in particular, the very important issue of the locus of enunciation of authors, writers, teachers within a foreign language education context. And then in conclusion, what might a decolonized foreign language education look like? So what I call foreign language education is in fact the teaching and learning of a language other than your own, or of those that you speak usually, that can be called foreign, second, or even heritage language, that you learn and use then in an institutional setting. Which is why that definition allows me to state right up from the start, that because foreign language education is dispensed and delivered within an institutional setting, it is by nature associated with the political and colonial power of national, very often national, educational institutions. I, as you know, or you may know, I was born and educated in France as a French citizen. And I know very well that the national French educational system, in its vision, in its values, in its philosophies, serves the goals of the French nation state, not only in order to help in the past the French nation state manage its colonies and to teach the French language to the people who were colonized in the French colonial empire, but also French children who were learning foreign languages in France, in school, as obligatory first or second languages, in order to prevent wars with French neighbors, German or Italian or English, and who were becoming, therefore, better French citizens. So the foreign language education that is delivered in educational institutions has, by design and by nature, a political and, one could say, colonial vision. Today, of course, under the influence of English as a foreign language that is being taught around the world, identity politics and that the global dominance of the English language have raised concerns about the coloniality of foreign language education. And I will explain presently what I mean by coloniality. Carmen Guerrero, in the forthcoming book that I will be talking about later, makes the difference between colonialism and coloniality. Colonialism, she explains, is the actual domination of one country by an external colonial power. Coloniality is a much more elastic and broader concept. It is the permanent process of material and symbolic exploitation, both domestic and abroad, very much linked to racial policies, racism, ethnic discrimination, and all kinds of other discriminations or dominations of the gender-related kind. Mary Louise Pratt makes the distinction between descolonization and decolonization. The concept of decolonization comes from Latin America under the name of descolonization. It is understood, however, in Latin America as a political process of historical change against capitalism and neoliberalism in all its forms. So whenever we look at research in decolonization that comes from Latin America, it will always have an anti-capitalist, anti-neoliberal flavor that you do not find necessarily in the term decolonization as it is being applied more widely in applied linguistics. Decolonization in English is an unspecified movement against inequities of race and gender and for greater social justice. In fact, Mary Louise Pratt, in that special issue, in that issue of Language, Culture, and Society, writes, it is important to know that the English and the Spanish terms are not at all identical. In Spanish, decolonial inhabits a semantic constellation that is distinct from and incompatible with that in English. While Mignolo and Walsh being the main proponents of decolonization, his disciplines who write in Spanish readily import the term decolonial into Spanish. The Peruvian intellectual Aníbal Cuyano, whose work inspired Mignolo's paradigm, never elides the decolonizing S. So when you talk with Latin American colleagues about decolonization, they always have the S in their mind. So you think you are talking about the same thing, and yet they have a totally different understanding and conception, historical conception of what descolonization is. In Cuyano's writing, English decolonial is always Spanish descolonial. I will return to this during my whole talk, because very often in international research, we think we're talking about the same thing because we're using the same seemingly the same word like decolonial. And in fact, we mean different things. And Guerrero down in the second paragraph here makes the point that the term discolonization in Spanish and as used in Latin America always points to language policies in Latin American countries that classify their members as first or second class citizens based on their ethnicity, color of skin, and whether they are compliant with the capitalist, white, male, Christian world system. So there again, we have the word decolonization that requires quite a bit of caveat. In foreign language education research in general, the word coloniality has meant domination, yes, but not necessarily domination by a foreign power. It has meant domination by the majority language of minority language speakers, such as, for instance, English dominant in the United States would be colonizing the people who are speaking other languages or who are native speakers of other languages. Domination by native speakers or speakers of the standard variety of non-native speakers or speakers of non-standard varieties. For instance, the Spanish spoken by Hispanics or Chicanos in the United States is seen as being dominated and sometimes colonized by those who feel that the only language worth speaking is standard Castilian Spanish. It is also used for the domination and denigration by heterosexual white speakers of non-binary, gendered, or non-white speakers who feel that they are being colonized by a heterosexual perspective on gender that marginalizes them. And then you have also the domination and stigmatization by monolingual speakers of bi or multilingual speakers. And right now, the whole movement to think multilingually or to validate, to value multilingualism is born out of a desire to diminish the domination of monolingualism and a monolingual mindset. So we'll return to that later in my talk. So, but what do the many publications of recent years on the topic of decolonization or colonization, what do they mean by decolonization? There is, first, let me put a parenthesis, there's a difficulty in identifying colonial practices because, as Mary Pratt quotes Gayatri Spivak, she says, colonialism's enduring power lies in its ability to constantly renew itself in non-colonial forms. They will say, what? I'm not colonizing gay people. I accept them as they are. And the gay will say, well, yes, but your heterosexual norms are colonizing me. So there is a kind of a difficulty in naming already what you're talking about because it likes to masquerade as something else. And Pratt continues in a rather devastating quote that I will read, contemporary academic practice recolonizes by granting Europe a monopoly on theory, a monopoly conceded over and over again by scholars in the Americas. And here comes the clincher. The extractive paradigm prevails. Latin America provides raw materials which are processed through European theoretical machinery and shipped back in already interpreted consumable form. As foreign language educators, we have to think, of course, whether the SLA theories, the applied linguistic theories that are developed in Europe and in North America and get exported for teachers of English in Africa, Latin America, etc., are not, in fact, colonizing their view of what it means to learn a foreign language according to theories that were born elsewhere in what will be called the global north. So let me give you a sense of the landscape of what has been or is being published under the, one could say, under the label of decolonization. You have first a body of work that fights against linguistic inequalities and social justice, fighting against what was called coloniality. And here I list first the whole, the first four entries are in fact the project by Alison Phipps on researching multilingually. It's an effort to get out of the monolingual attitude of theoreticians and researchers and looking at things multilingually, in particularly Prue Holmes, Alison Phipps are names that are associated with that effort. As you can see, the politics of researching multilingually, decolonizing multilingualism, all that fits into that paradigm of fighting against coloniality per se. You have the last two entries here, the recent book by edited volume by Troy McConaughey and his colleagues, Intercultural Learning in Language Education. Now, a publication like that doesn't have the word decolonization in there, but it does have the spirit of fighting against social injustice by taking into consideration other voices in the intercultural dialogue. A forthcoming volume by Danes that I have listed below, Heidi Bosian and the others, Translanguaging and Epistemological Decentering, follows the same spirit, and I will be talking about their research a little later, and that is forthcoming with Multilingual Matters. So that first body of publications are against fighting against any kind of domination, whether it's by a monolingual mindset or by a gender binary, gender bias, or racial biases. The second body of work is a body of work based on the unequal relation of power between speakers of foreign languages, particularly English, based on their linguistic, gender, racial, and ethnic identity. And under that body of work, I list, of course, the Doraldo Macedo, 2019, that has had quite a bit of influence on the field. There is a special issue of Applied Linguistics by Avineri and Martinez. And from their introduction, they talk about imagining futures, cultivating relationships for justice, very much based on reimagining powerful relationships that break down the colonization of race and gender by whites and straight people. There's also a forthcoming special issue of Applied Linguistics that focuses on the methods and practices of decolonizing knowledge and asks the question, will North meets South? And I will come back to that question also in my talk. Then there is an issue of critical inquiry in language studies that has an interesting article by Garcia, or Ophelia Garcia et al. In 2021, against what is called in decolonization studies, abyssal thinking, which is the belief that there is a strict divide between Western modernist knowledge and any other form of knowledge. And I will back to that presently. Then there is a third body of knowledge that are critical decolonial voices from both South and North in three issues of Language, Culture, and Society, with fascinating articles in the 2019, 20, and 21, fascinated articles by scholars of the so-called Global South and Global North, including articles by Mary Louise Pratt and our friend Sinfree McConey. So the challenges of all this body of work are captured for me in the three following quotes. One by Mary Pratt: there can be no translanguaging when the two languages have unequal power on the world stage, such as in the potentially colonizing relation of English to Spanish. I find that quote quite forceful and quite honest. People talking about, oh, how great it is. We can now in the class, we can translate, we can code switch between English and Spanish or English and other languages, forgets that English is the superpower language and that there can be no real translanguaging between unequal languages that have unequal power on the world stage. The second quote by Kuzi Kanki, who is an Andean scholar in Bolivia, and that I will be talking later on, says there can be no discourse of decolonization nor theory of decolonization without a decolonization practice. And what she means is a serious linguistic decolonization of words like, for instance, decolonization itself. Descolonization is not the same as decolonization. And we will engage in that a little later. And then a quote by François Tochon in the Macedo book: for language teachers who are critically aware, the decolonizing of the mind and emancipation are about thinking out of the monocultural and monolingual box and educating students for a multilingual mind. That quote is very important for me because it shows that in order to be really multilingual or crossing languages or translanguaging, you need to have a mindset that gets out of the juxtaposition of quantitatively plural languages or codes coexisting in your mind and get to a mindset, namely, what does it mean to think as a multilingual person? It means every single language that you speak is always implicitly put into relation with other languages and therefore deprovincialized and de-universalized. We'll get also back to that in a bit. So let's get in my second part some of those epistemological discontinuities that we have already encountered in the passage from descolonization to decolonization. First is when we talk about decolonization, like Mignolo and Catherine Walsh and Walter Mignolo, we're talking very often about the passage from modernism to pre or post-modernism. In other words, what decolonization is putting into question is the very modernity on which any kind of educational system, Western style institutional educational system, is based. And the question is, can the modernist paradigm be challenged by foreign language educators in the name of decolonization? Some of the tenets of modernism, I'll just list them without any particular order. We all know them because that's what we do when we teach foreign languages in institutional settings. We believe generally as language teachers in the linear scientific and educational progress. We believe, for instance, that communicative language teaching is better and scientifically more advanced than rote learning, for instance, or that translanguaging is better than blindly believing in the native speaker. So we believe in this linear progress that SLA is doing, or that our textbooks are doing, or that our language pedagogy is doing. We also, because we are language educators, we believe in measurability. We believe when we have our students translate from French into English or English into French, we make the students believe that French is totally translatable into English and vice versa. So these are some of the preconceptions, and we believe that the progress of a student can be measured according to measurable criteria. We believe in rational syllabi, in utilitarian syllabi. We believe in a literacy tradition based generally on the print literacy of yesteryear. We believe in standardization of languages. We teach standard languages. And in doing all this, we are, in fact, accomplices, one could say, in the monolingual policies of the nation state, because after all, that dominant language from which we are then teaching foreign languages is the avowed or non-avowed language of the nation state. Okay. There are other ways, of course, of viewing education, and that draws on tenets of pre-modernism or post-modernism, non-linear ways of thinking and speaking, explanations that don't ask you, like they did when I was in France, Mademoiselle Alvin, que dit le texte? What does the text say? But asks what the context is. Where do you place yourself as a speaker, as a writer? Qui parle? The word qui parle, who speaks, is a postmodern question. In my days, before modernism, before postmodernism, the question was, what does the text say? Not what do you say? What do you think? A postmodern or even a pre-modern way of educating for foreign language education was to pay attention to silences, to metaphors or poetic allusions, to give as much importance to the oral tradition than to the written, and all kinds of ecologies that are prevalent in a more ecological approach to teaching foreign languages. And in fact, several of these quotes that I have here will show you that there's much more, in fact, much more fluidity between modernist and pre-modernist or post-modernist ways of educating for foreign language learning. The Sri Lankan linguist Rambukwela, in that issue of Language, Culture, and Society, shows that there is much more fluidity than the distinction modernism, pre-postmodernism seems to suggest, in particular because of the recolonizing of pre or early modern concepts by first world academe. And here we have again this rather devastating conclusion that Mary Pratt did in the previous slide, showing that foreign language educators in the global north are much too keen on incorporating or recolonizing postmodern concepts like holistic, like ecological, like non-binary, etc., and rephrase them in colonial terms. Let me ask then the question that I pose at the bottom of this slide. My question that we're going to be dealing with is translanguaging then a form of recolonization of other languages by English as a global language? There's a lot of talk right now in foreign language education on doing away with the boundaries between languages. Some of that impetus came, in fact, from Maconie, who argued for disinventing languages. The question is whether the global north has not used Maconie's work to, in fact, advocate a translanguaging which, because of the disparity of power between English and other languages, is not a subtle backdoor way for recolonizing all other languages by English as a global language. I only need to remind you that Google Translate, for instance, translates all kinds of languages into one another, but always over English. In other words, Google Translate will translate something for you between French and German via English. So it is, in a sense, putting English again in the indispensable language position that I thought that decolonization was meant to remedy. So let's look at 3 examples of epistemological discontinuity, some of those major concepts that we use constantly as foreign language researchers. First, the term intercultural. Interculturalidad in Spanish or Portuguese, and interculturality. And I'm now going to confront De Souza Santos, the famous Brazilian philosopher, and Michael Barham, who both have something to say about interculturality. Now, what I have highlighted in English in the Santos quote harkens back to what we were saying before. For Santos, the essence of decolonization is intercultural translation. But intercultural translation, which is the chapter 8 in the Santos 2014 book, is the alternative to the abstract universalism, that kind of modernist attitude that grounds Western-centric general theories, and the idea that you can't translate anything at all because cultures are incommensurable. So his notion of intercultural translation advocates a new hybrid form of cultural understanding and intercommunication, but it is based on an attack against capitalism, colonialism, and patriarchy, and for social justice, human dignity, and human decency. In other words, Santos' view of intercultural translation is always based on a general understanding of a political context. Michael Barham, who is not a philosopher, but an educationist, a British educationist, says the following: culture is knowledge, but it is knowledge which is shared and negotiated between people. Is it possible to understand a foreign culture? The answer must be a qualified yes. Insofar as language is part of culture and can capture cultural meaning and experiences, then it is possible to interpret and describe a culture in its language. And we could say intercultural communication is then possible because the language holds the culture through the denotations and connotations of its semantics. You have right there the whole miscommunication, or let's say epistemological discontinuity, between Santos and Barham. Barham sees language as a linguistic system of denotations and connotations, and Santos sees language as a way of thinking and of political ideology. Guess who in recent years has had the most influence on foreign language teachers in the world? Is it Santos? Is it Barham? It is, of course, Michael Barham, because it does not upset the apple cart of political power. It conforms to what foreign language teachers, in fact, already know, is that language is a bunch of noun, verbs, and adjectives that needs to be learned by heart or through communicative practice, and that is the role of the language teacher. But Santos, of course, has a different view. Let's take another case, the case of the word relationality versus vincularidad. Mignolo, Walter Mignolo and Catherine Walsh pay a lot of attention to the notion of relationality. They said, they write, we are interested in relationality. And they contest the totalizing claims and political epistemic violence of modernity. So what they are arguing for is that we should be interested in relationality within a culture and between cultures, and that we should avoid the domination of modernist theories, and we should listen to theories that come from the global South. And then they write, relationality doesn't mean simply to include other practices and concepts into our own. It means references what some Andean indigenous thinkers refer to as vincularidad. So they take a Spanish notion like vincularidad and they say, let's not just juxtapose it to relationality, but find an equivalence between relationality and vincularidad. And they put vincularidad in italics to show that it is a Spanish Latin American term, coming from Latin, of course. And they write, vincularidad is the awareness of the integral relation and interdependence among all living organisms, of which humans are only a part, with territory of land and the cosmos. As such, vincularidad / relationality unsettles the singular authoritativeness and universal character typically assumed and portrayed in academic thought. Relationality / vincularidad seeks connections and correlations. Let me attract your attention to the fact that as I reproduce that quote on that slide, the only time that vincularidad is in italics is in the middle of that quote. The rest of the quote uses vincularidad without any italics, which in addition puts it at absolute par between vincularidad and relationality, as if in fact the two words were the exact translations of one another, meaning exactly the same thing. But is the semantic field of vincularidad coextensive with that of English relationality? Whereas the term relationality puts the focus on the in-between link between the two terms, vincularidad as a Spanish term that comes from Latin vincere, to link, is in fact already an attempt to translate Ecuadorian term sumac cause, a Quechua concept associated with buen vivir and better conceived of as plenitude, that means fullness of self in other and other in self. So here we have the case of a Quechua concept that indicates the relation of self and other as self in other and other in self, that is all of a sudden by Mignolo equated with relationality that has a totally different semantic field. English relationality, one could say, has colonized Spanish vincularidad, which had itself colonized the Quechua expression sumac causeway and made it into the translational equivalent of the two other terms. The reason I'm going into this is because what is lost in the process between the two translations is the two different worldviews that implies, and that have not transferred when, like Mignolo, we think that vincularidad is the same thing as the English term relationality. Robert Amann calls the fundamental difference between these three languages the colonial difference. The colonial difference between vincularidad and sumac cause, and the difference between sumac cause and relationality. There is a power differential here between the three languages that cannot be ignored. To round up this discussion of these three terms, the Andean scholar Silveira Rivera Cusicanti sees serious translinguistic work as an essential tool of decolonization. And she draws on another concept, another Andean concept of the Andean language Aymara. It's the concept of chi-chi, that means something that is and is not at the same time, and that is simultaneously itself and its opposite. And she has a lot of wonderful things to say about that concept, which is, one could say, untranslatable as such into English. Of course, it can always be paraphrased and explained, but we have in the English language no word to express something that is and is not at the same time. Let's take a third example, which is the savoir s'engager that foreign language educators around the globe understand if they have read Michael Byron's intercultural communicative competence work. Savoir s'engager is a French term that comes from Geneviève Zarat, and that has been built on in different ways by Michael Byron under the translation critical cultural awareness and Pennycook's translingual activism. So let's compare how the three authors fare in terms of engaging students to become social actors. For Zarat, savoir s'engager meant being a médiateur interculturel. The notion of mediation is fundamental to the conception of savoir s'engager by Geneviève Zarat, who, by the way, is an anthropologist. It's important to say where people speak from, which discipline they speak from. Geneviève Zarat is a French anthropologist, very much inspired by Pierre Bourdieu, and very much then insisting on the notion of mediation. Pennycook, as you know, is an applied linguist, a critical linguist, critical applied linguist. He argues for translingual activism, which is in fact no so long mediating, but actively in fact decolonizing both public spaces and languages. And he writes, moving beyond the rally, union, or ballot box to explore new modes of politics and new modes of resistance focused on more anarchist traditions of social media connected occupation. That's for Pennycook the definition of the social political engagement that foreign language learners should exercise. Byron, by contrast, argues for intercultural citizenship. He understands politics as taking an interest in action in improving the community or communities in which one lives. And recently, in fact, in a personal communication to me, he has vigorously rejected Pennycook's view of anarchist resistance and defined his position as in favor of, quote, reformist internationalism rather than revolutionary internationalism. So you have three reputed scholars here that, based on their different disciplinary locus of enunciation and discipline, understand, in fact, the concept of social actor differently. So both scholars go beyond party politics as transformative action, but for Byron, all education is transformative. That is what I would characterize as a more conservative educational philosophy. Pennycook goes further and puts into question the very knowledge base, the very epistemology of individuals, communities, and institutions. Byron is easier to to implement, let's say, for foreign language educators, Pennycook poses a real problem for foreign language educators who are being paid and hired and rewarded by an institution that has its own colonization practices because of their very nature. So let me just say a word about notions like global north and global south. In the same way as modernism and postmodernism, the distinction, the clear-cut distinction has been put into question. Scholars have put into question, the strict notions of the global north being the North Atlantic countries, Northern Europe, North America, and the global south being Latin America and Africa. Defina, Osterdup, and Ortega acknowledge that there is much more fluidity given the exchange in notions and ideas between these two parts of the world. And they end their quote here by saying there are souths in the geographic north and norths in the geographic south. This is exactly the process of colonization and decolonization going across the globe. Let's see, this one I will skip because we have done that already. I will move in for the sake of time to my editorial project. The book that I list here on top of the slide is a book that is about to be published next year with Routledge, and is an edited volume on decolonizing applied linguistic research in Latin America, moving towards a multilingual mindset. And it contains 10 authors. They are all non-English speak. I mean, they are English speakers, but non-native speakers of English. And the genesis of the project was born out of a symposium that we ran at ILA in 2020, and that reported on foreign language education practices in Argentina, Colombia, and Brazil. What I want to discuss with you is one important features of that book, is that as editors, and we are 3 editors, as you can see, we asked each author, each chapter, to begin each chapter with stating in 1,500 words their locus of enunciation. From where do they speak? From where did they conduct their research? Not only in which language, because they conducted that research very often in Spanish and Portuguese, but are now reporting on it in English for an international readership. And we found that that creates tensions within the volume that we find, in fact, intellectually quite fruitful. So we asked each author to write up their local of enunciation and reflect on what they said in one language and what they said in another language, asking them to write their locus of enunciation in 2 separate languages, one in English, one in the language, their own language, or the language in which they conducted their research. I have here as an example, with her permission, I am giving you passages of author number 1. Her locus of enunciation starts with the me in Spanish and the me in English. That was interesting enough to know which language would they present first and which second. My pronunciation in Spanish is not ideal, so I will leave it up to you to read the Spanish, but I can say that what I have highlighted in red means that she writes, empiezo por reconocerme, I start by recognizing that my identity is fluid, multiple, contradictory at times, and non-finite. I believe she has read Bonnie Norton's book on identity and language learning. The me that speaks here is crossed through many voices, many lives, and many experiences. And then she writes below, before being a teacher trainer, I was professor of English and Spanish at all levels of education, preschool, primary, bachelor, and university. That's the way she presents herself in Spanish. Now, when she writes in English, she writes the following. I was graduated as a PhD from and the name of the university in the US. I recall that during the commencement ceremony, there was a display of the flags of the countries the graduates came from. I saw the flag of my country and I felt very emotional because I would have never dreamed of that moment. I thought of the privileges I had enjoyed thanks to the access to public education. Her reflection on these two loci of enunciations is she tells you that she wrote these two things 2 days apart in order not to be influenced one by the other. And she says, in my autobiography written in Spanish, I locate myself geopolitically in the name of her country, a colonized country that for too long has embraced Western values and the pragmatism, and that has ignored knowledges otherwise. In the autobiography written in English, I locate myself as a woman who is graduating as a PhD from an American university, amazed at the odds of achieving such milestone, me, a child of a low-income family who lived in a small town in the name of her country. Right away, for those of you who know or understand Spanish and English, you can see the difference between these two renditions of yourself. In particular, now as an American, I find the second one really in the American style of introducing yourself, being grateful to America for having giving you the opportunity as a woman to become who you are. The very enunciation of this autobiographical note is a decolonizing practice in intercultural translation, I would argue. The author had to decide what to say about el yo que habla aquí and the me in English, what needed to be said and what could remain implied, what was best silence in each language, which concepts were translatable and which were not, and the assumptions that she could make in each language about her readers' state of knowledge. Let me say that I got a special permission by Routledge to have the first, the locus of enunciation in Spanish and Portuguese published without translation. I had to fight quite hard to have the two languages dealt with parallel and equal power to one another. This author had also to reflect on the distribution of the said and unsaid and the different ways in which she would structure her locus of enunciation and which enunciative identity she would choose to display. There were some difficulty among the authors that I will skip here. Maybe they'll come up because I see my time is coming up. So I want to show you a second locus of enunciation by a second author who presents himself as a mestizo who comes from a Latin American country but lives in a Western country where he teaches English and does ethnographic work in the Andes. I will leave you the liberty of reading the Spanish text because he gives an English translation of it. As you can see, he's trying to accommodate or to bring together the emotions and the reason and the rationality of modernism versus other ways of thinking in the following. I argue in his reflection on his locus of enunciation, he writes, I argue that an exercise on decolonizing the self is paramount as teachers and researchers are encouraged to center their work with their hearts, passions, and intentions to change a world in peril. And for doing that, he centers his article, his chapter, on a concept for the Muisca language from Colombia, another Andean language, called Cuy, that urges us to reframe, question, and challenge colonial, capitalist, and neoliberal modes of teaching and research. I am quoting this also with the permission of the author. Now, there are political risks in doing that. And one is the concept of Cuy, together with the word vincularidad that we saw earlier. The concept of Cuy was translated by the colonizers, the Spanish colonizers, as corazón, which means heart in Spanish, and is a concept from the Muisca language of Colombia that combines the notions of mind and heart. In fact, Latin American linguists say, en Muisca se piensa con el corazón. In the Muisca language, you think with your heart. So the Muisca language does not make the difference between cognition and emotions, something that is totally foreign. This non-division between emotions and cognitions is foreign, let's say, to research in foreign language education. Now, the author number 2 plays with the word corazón, which he says, includes con razón, which means with reason, which is a play on words that you cannot do with the word heart. However, not only is this notion difficult to translate into English, because you do not in English think with your heart, you think with your brain, you think with your mind. But in Spanish, and particularly in that phrase, cuy, it has the double meaning of emotion and cognition, meaning that corazón is duplo, the double heart, could easily be perceived as meaning untrustworthiness, duplicity, and treason, which was the case in colonial Latin America. Tiene el sentido de traidor, meaning it has the meaning of treason. If your heart, you can think with your heart, well, then you can't be trusted. The call, in fact, by Phipps to decolonize foreign language education and fighting against the globalizing policies of TEFL and TESOL are not without political risks. I like that idea of decolonization not being an innocent or politically innocent endeavor, but can lead you to ways of thinking that are so iconoclastic or non-acceptable in Western research that it could lead to not getting tenure or being fired or being called to the dean for your unusual or non-standard ways of looking at language. Let me get to my conclusion. It's high time. What might a decolonized foreign language education look like? We have undertitled our book, The Multilingual Mindset, and by that, I don't mean the mastery of various linguistic codes, but a particular way of seeing the world when mediated by more than one language. Foreign language educators with a multilingual mindset would be more likely to know that different languages express different epistemologies. These are not just codes, they are ways of thinking and of knowing and of acquiring and disseminating knowledge. Such educators with a multilingual mindset are more likely to recapture translation in foreign language education, but not in order to find equivalences, but to explore untranslatable mindsets, such as, for instance, the ability to think that something both is and is not at the same time. They are likely to be acutely aware of the different subject positionings indexed by the use of different languages, such as all the authors in our book that have to position themselves differently, whether they write in Spanish or Portuguese or in English. And foreign language educators with a multilingual mindset would recognize the different spatial scales and time scales under which different languages operate. They would take a non-binary view of people and events. They would develop political savviness. They would, of course, work for the institution, but know how to circumvent institutional constraints through non-institutional initiatives. And following Pennycook, they would espouse an anarchic epistemological activism. As Pennycook writes, we cannot turn our back on English, but we can seek to provincialize it, to place it where it belongs, to decolonize its words. I have a coda for you, which is a metaphor for how I imagine a decolonial foreign language education to be, which is Peter Bruegel's two depictions of the Tower of Babel that you will recognize. But I was taken by the description of these two towers, of these two paintings, by the German anthropologist Bernhard Streck, who takes quite an anarchic interpretation of those two paintings in a book that I list here by Maranhão and Streck, two anthropologists. And it says, whether interpreted as a ruin or a building site, the gigantic structure of world culture consists of a confusing wealth of arches, pillars, and stories linked with one another. As the Old Testament assures us reproachfully, but the cuneiform scripts express admiringly, the whole structure was intended as a bridge. Etemenanki, the foundations of heaven and earth, were to link the two poles of existence of the world under and above. Both in their cultures and between cultures, human beings are all pontifices, or bridge builders. I would like to add that Rivera Kuzikanki might say that the Tower of Babel is a perfect example of chi-chi, something that is and is not at the same time, something that both maintains the distinctions and binds them at the same time. Thank you for listening, and apologies if I went a little over time. I welcome your comments. Thank you. I understand that I do have lots of references, and they will be on my PowerPoint, and I understand that the PowerPoint will be made available. So I have all the references for you here.
Thank you so much, Professor Kramsch. Dr. McCartney, would you like to take the floor for the first few questions? Or
do I leave my PowerPoint on, or?
What do you think, Professor McCartney?
I think if she removes it, then we can all see each other.
Okay, so I will not share. I will delete the next share, right?
Yes, I think you can stop sharing the screen.
Okay, wait a minute. Stop share your screen. Stop share. Okay.
Okay.
I think I can see you all here.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Good. Yeah. Thank you very much, Claire. I thought when we were presenting, what I should do is to provide my own positionality, which may enable some people to understand the nature and the questions that I may pose in our initial conversation.
Yes.
And the positionality I'm going to read comes from our latest book called Decolonial Voices, Language and Race, which is the first volume from this global forum. And when I'm writing about my own positionality, I write in the following way. I'm a Black male migrant who is interested in the sociolinguistics of African languages at a major yet rural university in the global north. I, however, continue to retain strong personal and professional ties with many institutions in the global south. If I had not been a nomadic scholar, I would not have developed a strong interest in how knowledges are produced, developed, and circulated across the globe. The fact that I'm working on African sociolinguistics, a topic of marginal interest, has created and led to feelings of double marginalization for me. The advantages of the marginality have led me to develop a sharper sense of Eurocentrism and the centrality of the American empire in sociolinguistics. My personal history as a scholar wears a racialized history adds another important wrinkle to my academic life interest in race. This has led me to interest in colonial linguistics, Black linguistics, discrimination, and epistemologies of the South. I'm particularly interested in exploring how sociolinguistics would look like if it were framed from the global South. I argue that philosophically, some of the ideas which are important in contemporary sociolinguistics, such as multilingualism and ontology, were already in circulation in Africa prior to their appearance in the global north. Conceptually, I argue that modern sociolinguistics is moving and gravitating towards what we knew in African sociolinguistics in the late 20th century. When I grew up, I did not draw and maintain any firm distinctions between human and non-humans. The sociolinguistics which I seek to develop is one that goes beyond the human and includes communication with other species. This is a transdisciplinary approach which transcends the boundaries of single disciplines. Inasmuch as no single country can adequately and fully contain my research, my interests cannot be contained within one discipline. That's sort of the positionality that which may enable people to understand the questions that I am posing today and the series of projects that I am engaged in. I would like to ask the first question, Clara. I get you when you talk about foreign language education. Can I shift your mind to other aspects of applied linguistics? And then we can try and speculate what a decolonized, let's say, second language acquisition might look like. What would a decolonized, for example, language testing look like? In other words, let's leave for the time being decolonizing foreign language education and engage in a speculative exercise about how the other aspects of applied linguistics would look like if they were decolonized. Choose any other aspects or any other subdomain in applied linguistics that you might be interested in. And let's just play with our minds to see how that applied linguistics would look like if it were decolonized.
Yes. Yes. Well, thank you for framing it like that. What I notice in looking at a lot of the people that I cited is that I tend to gravitate in my interest and my passions more towards writings in anthropology, in theoretical linguistics. The people who inspire me the most come from people who have worked on the ground with languages from a more oral tradition that remind me that, in fact, and I say that as a pure product of the French educational system, that where we were indoctrinated in believing that print literacy was the non plus ultra, that orality was not of no importance. So I gravitate more towards anthropological linguistics, and it distresses me to see that foreign language education is still, I would say, hostage to a theoretical linguistic, a purely Saussurean way of looking at language in terms of elements of a structural system that have to be learned by heart or by communication in order to understand the others. And the more I've had to teach like that, teach German to French people or teach German to American students, the less I was inclined to think that they will better understand whether it's the native speakers or non-native speakers by learning adjective, nouns, and verbs. Of course, you need to know the form, the structure of the semiotic system, but I am, at the same time as I was learning foreign languages in France, the structuralist way and the numbing way of paying attention only to text, I was also trained to understand literary texts that require an incredible sensitivity to context, to co-text, to between the lines meanings that were not captured by nouns, verbs, and adjectives. And so I find that the way of the future for foreign language education is to draw inspiration from linguistic anthropology, which would lead you more readily into issues of decolonization than the structuralist kind of Saussurean way of looking at language that is still prevalent in most of foreign language classes around the globe. And the reason why people are not moving away from that paradigm is, I am convinced, for political reasons. Because the minute you make students aware of the relation between language and thought, you are in fact politicizing them into an understanding of language as a mode of thinking and a way of viewing the world. And you don't want them to view the world. I mean, in my case, none of my French teachers wanted me to see the world the German way. They wanted me to be a good French citizen, able to master the German code, but not to think like a German.
Okay. So thanks a lot for this. So the argument I think we are making is that irrespective of whether we intellectually like it or not, it is inevitable at this historical moment that we will have to think about decolonizing sub-disciplines that we are in. The question that I have now is, for foreign language teaching, for language testing, for other sub-areas in applied linguistics, how do we go about it if decolonization is an open-ended process, that we will never get there, that this is a route, that engagement that is permanent? So the question that I have, this very specific question that I have, is how do we go about it? Right, let's say if you look at foreign language education, assuming you had all the political resources available to you, how would you go about decolonizing foreign language education? Because why I'm asking this is that this is not just me speculating into the future. One of the defining features about decoloniality is the capacity to imagine a future tomorrow that you might never live to see. Right. So if that is the sense, because of a sense of political commitment, my question is, how do we go about this? You may push back, for example, and ask me, how do we go about decolonizing language policy and planning? That's another story. But I'm just curious to know the how of decoloniality.
Yes, yes, but I understand you saying, how do we go about it? The we for me is important.
Yes.
And I understand that I can only understand the we as the foreign language teacher.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, as a foreign language teacher, I am paid and I am employed and hired to teach, quote unquote, the foreign language.
Mm-hmm.
I can only understand your question as what is it, how can I change or decolonize both teaching and the object of my teaching, or, or change the vision of my students as to that object. And that's why I have tried to put a plug for translation.
Yes.
Translation has always been kind of the bread and butter of foreign language, for foreign language educators. But it has been wrongly conceived as the search for equivalences. And you get a good grade, or you got a good grade in my time. Inversion and thème, translations into the foreign language and the foreign language into yours. If you found a translation that was the best equivalent possible to the other language. I am putting a plug for translation as a pedagogic principle of exploration of precisely those untranslatabilities or incompatibilities between concepts in one language or the other. I don't see how becoming fluent in French is going to help you understand the whole debate about laïcité right now, or about the immigrants in France right now. You have to then discuss, and then the question arises, in which language will you do that in the classroom? And I find that under the motto of effective language teaching and fluency to be attained, the current climate is disastrous to have the students discuss what another person has in his or her head because of the language he or she speaks. All the students want right now is to sound fluent, to sound like somebody else, to have fun with the language, to play around with the code as if it was a computer code. I thought that learning a foreign language was to learn what the speaker of that language might have in his or her head. But that's not where foreign language is right now. So I'm only sharing with you my despair. I'm not.
Okay. This is just my last comment, and then I'll give over to Magda, because there are a lot of people in the chat box who want to intervene. I agree with you that trying to define what decolonization means is difficult, because it means different things to different people in different traditions. The Latin American tradition may be very different, for example, from what decolonization might mean in North America, where it is linked more to issues about social justice. Those of us who work on decolonization in Africa link it much more to issues about reparations and social action. I am more inclined personally, idiosyncratically, to opt more for talking about Southern epistemologies rather than decolonization, because decolonization narrows my mind towards colonialism and coloniality. But when I talk about Southern epistemologies, I can then look at a number of different intellectual strands and orientations, issues about gender, patriarchy, and colonialism. So in a way, basically what I'm sort of, this is some me grumbling. What I'm saying is that I hear what decolonization has to offer, but intellectually I feel much more liberated when I'm able to talk more about Southern epistemologies, in which decolonization happens to be one aspect of this massive thing called Southern epistemologies. So for example, in our book that is coming out 2-3 weeks from now, called Language in the Global South, that's what we try and do. The key thing there, I think, is the South as a pluralistic event. The South is a pluralistic geographical entity. Yeah, let me stop there. Otherwise, I was just rambling on. Don't worry about that, Clary. You don't have to respond to that. There are more important questions to come.
No, but I'm grateful to you to put the topic, to put the discussion on the epistemological
Yes.
level. Yes, and I think the field of applied linguistics and foreign language education in general would do good to talk less about code and more
Yes.
about epistemology. Yes.
Yes. Yes. I agree with you. Yeah. Okay. Right.
All right, thanks. I'll be stepping in for Magda to moderate the Q&A. So we have a lot of questions and comments. So first I'll start with a comment from Fethi Halal. So thanks, Claire, for this exhaustive and thorough presentation. It spans the South and the North, the colonial and decolonial world. It reviews and discusses and raises other problems true to the nature of the academy in the global South or the global North. So that's just a quick overarching comment. And then we have a more specific question from Magda that says, Profe Kramsch, could you elaborate on the potential of interculturalidad crítica in FL education? Can it, and if so, in what ways mediate the ideology of globalism in Latin America?
So to elaborate on the concept of interculturalidad and?
Can it, and if so, in what ways mediate the ideology of globalism in Latin America?
Yeah, it's the issue of intercultural translation, really, by De Souza Santos, and how can that be put into practice in foreign language education in Latin America? I don't know about teaching globalism, but there are practices, educational practices to give a voice to indigenous language speakers in the classrooms in schools, for instance, in Argentina or in Colombia. I notice, however, in the authors of the book that I'm working on together with Castañeda and Gamboa, that it's easy to fall into into a charitable or benevolent kind of condescending kind of position, where you will give the natives a voice by asking them to describe their culture in the classroom, and then they remain silent. It's a question of changing the mindset and depending on what the institution makes possible, not just respecting the silences of the indigenous students, but devising activities in which they can do something else than talk, maybe share in another semiotic mode, but or translate. In the case of intercultural translation, they can use other semiotic ways of making meaning that would not necessarily have them talk in so many ways about something that they don't want to talk about because it's part of their cultural heritage. That is, in fact, exactly the efforts of Alison Phipps in her project researching multilingually.
Okay, thank you so much. All right. Our next question related to that from Yasida is, if foreign language educators and researchers move into this new paradigm of non-linearity and ecological forms of teaching and doing research, how do we envision academic writing and its strict language rules for publication and standardized testing as a way to measure who gets to immigrate or study abroad?
Oh, wait a minute. There are many questions in there.
I can repeat it if you'd like.
Because one is doing research according to ecological, I mean, there's a whole postmodern way of doing research and ecological ways of doing research. That is one field, but then there was also the teaching, how to teach in a postmodern way. I'm not quite sure I understand where to put the priorities here.
Yeah, if you could, they mention academic writing and then standardized testing. So how does this new paradigm kind of relate to those, or how do academic writing and standardized testing fit into this new paradigm maybe?
Well,
or do they not?
Writing, the market, the publishing market will is more subject to fluidity and flexibility, as my example of Routledge shows, that I was able to convince Routledge of publishing 3 pages of written prose without translation. I had to fight for it and make an argument for it, but that was more possible than trying to persuade my institution of not using standardized testing to test their students. It's a different kind of power. The power of publishing houses and academic writing is a different kind of power than the power of an educational institution that is responsible or has to respond to the demands of the employment market and the job market. These are all constraints but that is not generally how language educators see their job. They don't see their job as linked to an institutional ideology that forces them to do things, and whether they have the choice to it requires a certain political activism within your campus and within your institutional constraints to manage to enact different ways of testing that are not standardized testing.
All right, thank you so much. Our next question comes from Fethi Halal, or comment. So Olufemi Tayo, in his new book, Against Decolonization, Taking African Agency Seriously, argues that decolonization has a reactionary ring to it and it should be abandoned, and that we should take the notion of agency seriously if we are to decolonize Africa. He further argues that decolonialism racializes modernity and insulates backward cultural practices from critique. I would add, this thinking perpetually entraps underdeveloped societies in poverty and ignorance. So I don't know if you want to comment on that at all.
Yeah, well, that has been, how can I say? Let me express again my gratitude to Makoni for having invited me to talk about this, but I am not the decolonization is not my field of research. And so I took the opportunity to be within a group of specialists on decolonization, to give my 2 cents worth of how it would apply to a foreign language teacher. But I have my doubts about whether the concept of decolonization or the whole field of research, whether it's worth or not worth, whether it's racializing the very people or the very things that it's studying, that's almost beyond my competency.
Okay, thank you. All right, and now I have a question from Bonnie Norton. So thank you for an outstanding presentation, Claire. My question is as follows. How do we take seriously the issue that Byram's reformist approach to interculturalism has far greater appeal to practitioners than Pennycook's more radical approach?
Thank you, Bonnie, for that question, because it's exactly the reason why I pushed my co-editors of that volume to insist that they write up their locus of enunciation at the beginning of each chapter, which is, and I must admit that among the authors for that volume are some who have worked with Michael Byram, have tried to decolonize the classroom that they have observed or that they have been teaching by using Michael Byram's intercultural communicative competence theory. But I felt that they were not going far enough in terms of decolonization, and that they needed to reflect on Michael Byram via a decolonization framework. And to do that, I had to put them personally at the beginning of the chapter to say where, from a colonization perspective, where did they position themselves? And I felt that that was not only an editorial move, but that it was an educational move, if you wish, that I was reframing their Michael Byram's inspired research project into a decolonial one.
Perhaps I could just say, first of all, thank you for that, Claire. But I think what that also means is that you are trying to work with the frameworks that are familiar to foreign language educators, and then perhaps shift, the position. And I think pedagogically, I think that makes a great deal of sense. And I think it will probably be far more effective than simply kind of imposing a particular position, but working with what is familiar to teachers, I think has the most effect pedagogically. So thank you very much.
Let me add that there has been some resistance. Some authors do not like to think that they think differently in Spanish and in English. They don't like to even identify themselves with a country, a gender, an ethnicity, or a language. They find refuge in a professional identity that they see as universal. I am a foreign language teacher. I am neither Argentinian nor Colombian nor Brazilian. I am neither a man nor a woman. I am neither black nor white. I am just a foreign language teacher, which is interesting in itself.
All right, thank you so much for those comments. So our next question from Fethi is kind of long, so bear with me. So they say, of course, Professor Claire Kramsch is very familiar with the North Africa Maghreb context due to the massive historical and geographical connections between these countries. What can you say about intellectuals having their training in France to return to their home countries very little informed about the realities of their societies. And then included in the chat is a longer anecdote about a Tunisian sociologist. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
So wait a
at
minute.
all.
The question is, how does
What can you say about intellectuals having their training in France to return
Yes.
to their home countries, very little informed about the realities of their own societies? I can read it's just a bit long, the anecdote. So this story is told by a Tunisian sociologist who died recently at the age of 87. Probably the best sociologist of his generation, this sociologist named Fred Stambouli was trained in the Sorbonne, where he had his PhD, in London and New York. He started teaching at the University of Tunis in 1964, 6 years after the establishment of the first university in Tunisia, with a generation of other university lecturers of like-minded training and expertise. When they started teaching about the sociology of North African societies, he said that knowledge of their own societies was insufficient to analyze and theorize about them, specifically Arabism and Islamism. They were unable, for example, to understand the failure of Arab armies in 1967 against Israel, the spectacular success of the Iranian Revolution 3 years later, the return of political Islam in Tunisia during the 1980s. He said that he worked hard to adjust to this knowledge and catch up. So I don't know if Fethi, you want to jump in and add any more context, or if you can comment on that.
Yeah, well, I mean, that is part of the issue, is what do intellectuals who come from one country then move to another country, when they come back to that country, they tend, and I can speak now for myself, it is not because I've spent the first 29 years of my life in France, was trained and educated in France, that 40, 50 years later, you return to France and you are no longer you are absolutely not an expert on French intellectual life, the issues that are discussed in France. And that is the fallacy, is that as a native speaker, of course, you understand and you read and you try to keep abreast, but you are no longer in the conversation that is going on in France. And so and yet you are asked, because you have made a name for yourself abroad, you are asked to come back into your native country and you are treated as an expert, which you are not, requires a certain dose of humility. That's all I can say.
Yeah.
Cécile Vigourou had a question about translanguaging.
Yes, I'll ask Cecile's two questions now. So her first question is, it seems to me that the Latin American ways of thinking about decoloniality have been the main influence in applied linguistics as practiced in the global North. How do you explain that African thinkers who have long talked about similar issues since the 1960s and 70s haven't received a similar intellectual interest? Are we not creating other forms of intellectual hegemony and, in a way, circular discourse regarding issues of decoloniality and language?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that has to do with the transnational commerce of expertise and popularity and quotability. For the case of Africa, why do African philosophers not make it into the consciousness of North America? I would say that it's because they are generally hitched to a Francophone intellectual environment or universe that does not get recognized in the United States. I mean, there is, La French theory, okay, but apart from that, there are some blind spots in the exchange of ideas that are devastating, tragic. Yes.
Okay, thank you. And the second question is, can you please elaborate on translanguaging as a new form of colonization or colonizing?
Yes. I'm glad you picked up on that because it's a taboo subject today to put in question translanguaging. And I'm going to get tomatoes or eggs in my face for daring to say that maybe translanguaging is a neo-colonial practice. But I do feel that Mary Pratt was right when she pointed to the power differential between English and even French, or I say even French, look at me. I think translanguaging is used very often by foreign language teachers as an excuse to bring back English into the foreign language classroom. Oh, how quaint. Look at them. They are bilingual. They use Denglish or Chenglish, and English seems to be the ubiquitous, inescapable, incontournable language of the planet.
All right, thank you so much. With that, I think I'll hand it back to Makoni to make any final comments and questions, and then we can keep it going a little bit after in our after party if needed.
Yes, thank you very much, Clara, and thank you very much to everybody who has attended. What was fascinating about this session was that we were able to focus more on, let's say, discussions about decoloniality and the implications in a particular aspect of our applied linguistics, foreign language education. And then I think the last statement that Clara made, which some people may regard as not as a very sacred statement, but it's very useful, that is it possible that translanguaging is a neo-colonial act? What that suggests, whether you agree or disagree, what it suggests is the importance of us continuing to review and to think critically about anything that we do, starting from decoloniality itself as a concept and to any other concepts that we are taking for granted as desirable. In light of that, I'd like to say to Clara, thank you very much for finding time to spend your Saturday with us. Now we're now moving on to the after party, where if, for example, you had some comments that you want to make, but you didn't have a chance, you can ask, and this is not moderated. For example, you may want to talk to John Joseph directly about a particular issue. You can now ask him, and he doesn't have to respect the protocol. He can respond directly to your questions. Yeah.